We were looking at the parables. Tonight we're going to start looking at some of the prophets in the Old Testament. And I want us to start tonight looking at a timeline of the writing prophets. What I mean by the writing prophets are just those that wrote parts of the Bible. There are prophets that we know about, like Elisha, that we don't know of anything he wrote, but we're looking at the ones that actually wrote parts of the Bible. And tonight, we're not going to get a lot of application, or any application perhaps, but it's to set a foundation for trying to understand them a little bit better, just having an idea of when they were in relation to each other. And some of them we don't really know. We're going to have to just make guesses if we want to put them on a timeline, but we'll talk about that as we go. All right, so when we look at these dates are approximate. They're not exact dates. They're just to give you a general idea of when these prophets were writing. And so the first ones that we would look at are and Moses and Joshua. We don't know for sure that Joshua wrote. We believe, because he was a prophet, we believe he probably wrote the book of Joshua, or at least parts of it, and perhaps finished the book of Deuteronomy that Moses began, because it talks about Moses' death. But that's a guess that Joshua is one of the writing prophets. But that was probably about 1,500 years before Christ that Moses was writing. And I just put it up to about 1,300 with Joshua. But so this would be the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are all written by Moses. And then there's the book of Joshua, which perhaps Joshua wrote. Then you go about 500 years after Moses, and you get to Samuel, the time of Samuel. It was around 1100 to about 1,000 years before Jesus. And so we read about a book, the chronicles or the records of the kings that were written by Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, which I assume, it doesn't, we don't know for sure how that lines up, but I assume that those would line up with at least 1st and 2nd Samuel. Because it makes sense if it's named Samuel, that Samuel was one of the authors, but he dies in 1 Samuel. So he was not the one who completed those records, but perhaps that's why Nathan and Gad are included as being part of who wrote one book. So 1st and 2nd Samuel may have been written by those three. It's guessed that Samuel also wrote the book of Judges and the book of Ruth, although we don't know that for sure. We're not told who wrote those books. But that's about 500 years after Moses is when we come to the time of Samuel. And then we have, after him, I guess the most prolific or one who wrote the most right after him would be Solomon. We don't know who wrote the book of Job. It is guessed by some that Solomon wrote it. It could have been written before. It could have been written later. We don't know for sure. But I'm just putting it here with a question mark. And then we have Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, written about this time. And Proverbs began to be written about this time because most of it are the Proverbs of Solomon. But then we find that parts of it were also compiled by the men of Hezekiah, which was much later. And then there are some proverbs by some other people that we're not even sure who they were at the end of the book. So it was composed over a fairly long period of time. We don't really know when 1st and 2nd Kings were written, so I've just put it in this place, and I don't know who wrote those. But then we get to the time of Ezra after the captivity, when they've returned from captivity, about approximately 500 years after Samuel. So from Moses to Samuel is about 500 years. From Samuel to Ezra is about 500 years. So the Old Testament essentially is being written over a period of about 1,000 years. And so probably at the time of Ezra, if not by Ezra himself, we get 1st and 2nd Chronicles being written because of how 2nd Chronicles ends with them returning, the decree from Cyrus. We have the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Esther, which takes place during the book of Ezra, between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra, if people are right about the timing there, and it seems to make sense there. And then the book of Psalms is written over the course of all this time. So you have some Psalms by Moses, you have some that are written after the captivity, after they've returned. And so you have, of course, the primary, or the majority, I should say, of the Psalms being written around the time of David. So right there in the center of this time. So that's a very general timeline of kind of an overview of these things. But when we talk about the prophets, as in the major prophets and the minor prophets, where do those fit in? All of them are going to take place closer to the time of Ezra than to the time of Moses or Samuel. So when we look at these, again, these are approximate dates. Also, I'm not entirely sure if these are always accurate. I'm not a great scholar myself, so I have to depend on others to research when these different kings were, when these prophets were prophesying. And some of the books don't give us a date as well, or which kings they were prophesying during, but some of them do. And so with Amos, it seems like he's probably the earliest of the prophets and the major or minor prophets, around close to 800 years before Jesus, up to about 740 years before Jesus. Jonah probably overlapped with him, 780 to 750 BC. So because he's mentioned as being during the reign of Jeroboam II in Israel, that's about the timing that they believe that king was reigning. And then about right after Jonah's time, you get Hosea and Micah. So they were prophesying at pretty much the same time period, during the same kings, not necessarily completely overlapping. We don't know exactly, how long they lived or how long they worked as prophets of God, but during the kings whose time this spanned. So from about 750 years before Jesus to 680 years before Jesus, you get Hosea and Micah. And you get Isaiah during this same time period, just a little, maybe starting a little bit later because of where he, the things that he's talking about and the kings that he is prophesying during. And so the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel. So when Assyria came and captured the northern kingdom of Israel, happened about 722 BC. And so that's during the prophecies of Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah, and just not long after Jonah and Amos. Okay, so a lot of these prophets, they do include the prophecy of what would happen to Israel, and it did happen. And I have it going up to about 605 BC because that's when the Babylonians actually conquered the Assyrians. So it would no longer be the Assyrian captivity at that point. Nahum prophesies against the Assyrians in about 665 BC, or to 612 BC, somewhere in that time range, and so he's prophesying about the fall of Nineveh, and it does fall. Habakkuk and Zephaniah seem to be during this time leading up to the Babylonian captivity. So we don't know really with Habakkuk. There's not anything in the book that necessarily dates it. But the guess is, based on the things that he's talking about, that it's about during the same time period as Zephaniah. But that is a guess. So that's about 640 to 610 years before Christ, 610 years before Christ. Somewhere in there would be about the time that Habakkuk and Zephaniah would be prophesying. Then we have Jeremiah coming during that time, during the same time period, general time period as Habakkuk, Nahum, and Zephaniah, also before the Babylonians come and take over, and also after that time. He prophesied for quite a long time. The ones in green here, by the way, are the ones we call the major prophets. The ones in blue are the minor prophets. That just means their books are shorter. The major prophets have longer books. So Jeremiah is around 630 to 550 years before Christ. And so he covers quite a lot of things that are happening. He prophesies about Jerusalem falling to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians capture the Assyrians. And so you have a time where the northern kingdom of Israel is now under captivity to the Babylonians, but Judah is still free. But then in about 597 BC, you have the Babylonians capturing or starting the capture of Jerusalem and Judah. And so they're taking certain ones away into captivity and eventually destroying the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and taking most of the people away. And so Jeremiah is prophesying during that time. He even he goes through the destruction of the city of Jerusalem while he's living in Jerusalem, and he prophesies after that as well. And so it's a guess as to how far he goes, but in time. But it's about 550 years before Christ when he would have stopped his prophesying, because he probably died from old age at that point. But Daniel comes along around the middle of this time, in 605 BC, when he's taken into captivity in Babylon. He's one of the early ones, and so he covers quite a lot of the time of this captivity, and even into the return. We have him during the reign of Cyrus, and so we find this that he covers almost pretty much all the 70 years, of the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel comes in with a shorter time period, about 20 years, if that is accurate, but I think that's approximately right. And he prophesies before the destruction of Jerusalem and after. And so he's in Babylon. He was taken away, and he has a lot of visions from God, a lot of prophecies about what would happen in Jerusalem, which did happen, about things that would happen later as well. But he fits right in there along with Jeremiah and Daniel. So those prophets are all prophesying at the same time for about 20 years or so. Then you have Obadiah, who we don't know exactly when he's prophesying. He prophesies against Edom, and generally the idea of prophecies against Edom are that it's because of how they behaved when Jerusalem and Judah were taken into captivity. And so it's guessed that it is some time after the captivity, after they've been taken. So this is just a guess of where Obadiah fits in. Okay, then we have this return from captivity. And during this time, you have the building of the temple first. So the first ones that were sent back, Zerubbabel and others, were sent back to build the temple. And they got stopped for a good long while until God sent the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And so that was around the year 520 BC. And Zechariah, I believe, prophesied a little bit longer. At least his writing covers a longer time. This is I just made up the ending time, 515. I don't know how long. I didn't check to be very accurate on that, but a little bit longer. He covers some more years than Haggai does. And Ezra then comes in at around 490 BC, and this is after, he comes after the temple is built. But the book of Ezra starts with the return of the people to build the temple. But I don't know if Ezra was even alive at that point, because we're not told how old he is at any point. But he is probably working on the writing from around 490 to 420 BC, somewhere in that range, and perhaps writing First and Second Chronicles and some other books, even if he did that. He was a scribe, so it's not. And a prophet. So it's not unlikely that he did that, but we don't know for sure. Then you have the building of the wall, which Nehemiah led, and Nehemiah also is at least one of the authors of the book of Nehemiah because of how it's written. And so he was around 445 to 420. He overlaps with Ezra. Ezra is there when Nehemiah comes. And then you have the book of Joel, which honestly we have no idea when it's written. Some people put it here very late. Some people say it's one of the earliest of the prophets. The context of the book doesn't give us much to go on as far as dating it. So I put it here because some were saying it is very late, but honestly, I don't know where it goes. The book of Joel, the message we can get, the date, not so much. And then you have Malachi, who prophesied, again, we don't know the date, but because of the content, it seems like it was around the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, maybe a bit after them. And so we say that was around 400 years before Jesus. And as the last of the writing prophets, until the New Testament, we have that being the 400 years of silence. That's an approximate number. But there's approximately 400 years between Malachi and John the Baptist, who's not a writing prophet, but when Jesus comes, and then, of course, the New Testament starts to be written later. But we have this time where you have a lot of prophecy going on from about, we'll say, 800 years before Jesus to about 400 years before Jesus. So there's 400 years where there's a lot of prophecy going on, a lot of written prophecy. And you can see that a lot of these prophets are prophesying at about the same time. They overlap. Some of them prophesy about very similar things. Some of them prophesy about completely different things. But when we look at these prophets, understanding when they were prophesying, that it was leading up to the Assyrian captivity of Israel, or leading up to the Babylonian captivity of Judah, or that all those things have already happened, or when there's a return from the captivity and there's a looking forward to the coming of Jesus 400 years later. Understanding the time is helpful just to understand what the book is talking about. So even though you didn't get any application tonight, I hope that this is a useful tool just to have this in your mind when we talk about the prophets. All right, that's the lesson for tonight. Thank you.